Okay, folks, welcome to the third panel, if I can count properly, of the symposium today, Greening Energy Policy. I'm Mark Rumble, and I teach here, and I'm delighted to serve as a moderator. I will mercifully keep my time extremely short and introduce very briefly the five presenters that we have today. And each presenter will have about 10 minutes to talk to us about their work, and then that will leave plenty of time for conversation and discussion. Before I go any further, I really would like to thank our students and Hari Asosky for doing this today. It's a real delight, and not only a topical issue, but a testament to a lot of the energy and commitment that we have here at WNL about a lot of these issues. And of course, I'd like to thank all of the panelists, both in this panel and others, for participating. It's a great honor to have five distinguished scholars with us today, and I'm just going to introduce them extremely quickly in the interests of brevity, which means one line where they're at. And our first speaker will be Professor Rebecca Bratspies from the City University of New York School of Law, who has a bit of an ongoing relationship with some of our scholars at WNL. I've known Rebecca for a bit, and she's involved with my wonderful colleague Russ Miller, who's here on a number of projects. Our second speaker will be Professor Jim Casey from here at WNL, not here as in the law school, but there, right? So, which matters too. We talk about space and scale. I know this is central to Hari's work, so we can scale the college into us here, and it's a wonderful pleasure to have Jim with us here. Our third presenter, who will be participating remotely, is Professor David Markell of the Florida State University College of Law. And as I understand from Hari, we will have the first two presenters, and then David will magically appear on the screen. So I've been told I don't actually need to push any button, and we'll be good on that front. All right. Our fourth speaker will be Professor Noah Sachs from the University of Richmond School of Law, who's right here to my left. And our final speaker will be Professor Marceline Burke did I get it right? Thank you. We practiced before. At the University of Houston Law Center, who will be our fifth speaker. So without any further ado, I'd like to invite Rebecca up to the podium, and you will have 10 minutes.
So thank you. Thanks to the Journal and to Hari and to everybody here. So I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about trust and the role that trust plays in structuring social decisions that are taken under conditions of uncertainty. And I thought it might be interesting to look at questions that arise in the context of climate change through that lens and see sort of what advice surfaces for the Obama administration. So today I want to focus in particular on a series of leases that were issued over the past year for oil exploration in the Chukchi Sea, and examine them through a trust lens, and then we'll see what comes out of it. Now, as a candidate and now as president, Obama has expressed a commitment to use the regulatory powers of the state to promote both good governance and reasoned decision-making. And quite frankly, given the shambles that is U.S. climate change policy, it will take all of that and more to achieve the president's stated goal of making the United States into a climate change leader. Now, so far, I think his decisions have been encouraging. But as I look at it, I see sort of a lack in terms of an overarching, coherent theory for how to operate administratively to achieve some of the goals he's identified. And I'd like to suggest that regulatory trust can provide that organizing principle. Deliberative action with an eye towards cultivating regulatory trust will not only drive climate change policy forward, but will create an administrative culture of decision-making that is both perceived and is actually responsible, accountable, and progressive. So we're having this conversation in a time of great crisis in our nation and in the world. And that crisis has a lot of regulatory ramifications. We have well-documented declining levels of trust in government, and this phenomenon limits the capacity of government to respond effectively to the various crises that we face. Now, it's a reality that government must make high-stakes regulatory choices that implicate poorly understood risks. In that circumstance, trustworthy regulation can enhance overall social resilience, but uncertainty erodes trust on all fronts. Loss of trust then undermines not only regulatory efficiency, but also society's overall capacity to persevere and even thrive in the face of multiple unpredictable risks. So, what do I mean by regulatory trust, I keep saying? There are, as I envision it, there are three components that I'm going to walk through very briefly and then move on to how they play out in the context of the CHUG-C. So there's expertise, which is fairly self-explanatory, except that I think it goes beyond merely the commitment to sound science and to making decisions based on scientific principles, but also to a recognition of the limits of science and the sort of domain boundaries of most expert knowledge. Decision-making under uncertainty often elides that point and ignores the way that values are used to get from data point to data point and interpret things to create an overarching theory. Stewardship. Now, what I mean here is something beyond mere good governance. Not talking just about efficiency, not talking just about competence, though those are obviously a baseline that would be nice to have. But something more than that, a commitment to inclusion as both a principle and a practice, a commitment to systemic evaluation and decision-making that advances towards an identified goal. Transparency, again, fairly self-explanatory, except I'm looking for something a little more robust than a mere one-way flow of information to the government. Though again, as a minimum, that is an essential part of this. But transparency can mean a lot more than that. It can mean a much more integrated interaction between various stakeholders and groups. So together, these three components can provide a critical source for resilience under conditions of uncertainty. Now, all three are implicated in the what I consider to be regulatory failures that surround the oil leases issued in the CHUG-C. So lessons from this saga can be instructive in figuring out not only what not to do, but also what to do, the kinds of regulatory processes that are most likely to build trust and therefore support legitimacy of vital and contested government decisions made under conditions of uncertainty. So just a few brief reminders why we need a process capable of generating regulatory trust and just how fragile that trust is. So to give you a rough idea of what's at stake in the CHUG-C, let me tell you just a little bit about this unique area of the world, about which we actually know very little. It is critical habitat for polar bears, whales, walruses, and the spectacled eider. Now, many of these animals are designated threatened or endangered species, and the critical habitat designation is actually a legal designation as well as a description of the area. Now, polar bears are going to factor rather prominently in the conversation I want to have because there's been a lot of legal action about them. And of course, this conversation about critical habitats is not even to mention the human inhabitants of the region who have a subsistence culture that has existed for millennia and that is directly threatened by the changes that are being wrought by global warming. So this area also is reputed to have rich petroleum resources. It's believed to hold 15 billion barrels of recoverable oil and 76 trillion cubic feet of recoverable natural gas. Now, for perspective, the U.S. daily consumption of oil is almost 21 million barrels a day. So we're talking about maybe a 2-year supply of oil at current usage levels. So with that backdrop, let's turn to the process by which leases were sold for oil exploration in this area, and why I think this particular regulatory saga highlights important questions of trust in the U.S. regulatory system. So this is a timeline of the regulatory process. A division of the Department of Interior, Mineral Mining Services, which was in the news for some other rather interesting choices that the Denver office made, not the same people who are making this set of decisions. Seems like a fairly straightforward timeline, but looks can be deceptive. So this slide puts that sequence into the context of other clearly related regulatory processes going on at the same time within the same rubric of the Department of the Interior. In particular, I highlighted the ongoing saga of the Fish and Wildlife Service, again, an agency under the Department of Interior, which the Mineral Mining Services is also part of, whether or not to list the polar bear as an endangered species and how to respond to global warming. Now, at each decision point, right, that was highlighted in the initial timeline, MMS should have been influenced by these other ongoing decisions, but wasn't. In fact, one thing I want to particularly direct your attention to is that a decision on whether or not to list the polar bear as threatened under the Endangered Species Act was expected weeks before the sale took place, but was stalled. In fact, there was a statutory deadline that the decision be made by then, but instead the decision was made months later. Now, critics have suggested that this listing was deliberately halted in order to facilitate this oil lease auction. And in fact, the Department of Interior cited the fact that polar bears were not listed under the Endangered Species Act as the reason it would not impose requirements on oil companies to minimize risks. Now, many would stop here and say, bad government, or corrupt government, or bad Bush administration even. And any or all of those may be true. But what interests me is looking a bit farther. What does this reveal about legitimacy? What does this reveal about trust? So I'd like to walk through sort of how the trust components I identified play out in this context, and my time is short, so I'll see if I can do it. In terms of expertise, right, despite the pleadings of agency scientists, cumulative effects of all of these different developments were not considered. The one to your left is the Chukchi Sea, the yellow one is the Beaufort Sea, and this is the North Slope oil. And the polar bear population in particular is one continuous population, and there's a sense that many of the other threatened and endangered species are also one continuous population. Failing to consider cumulative effects means that they didn't capture the actual effects on these species. Also, there was a systematic underestimate of the likelihood and risks posed by an oil spill. In particular, despite concluding that any lease would have to produce 1 billion barrels of oil in order to be economically viable, MMS used a much lower figure for calculating the likelihood of an oil spill. So their calculation of the likelihood of an oil spill, which by the way was 40%, was based on a level of exploitation that they had already decided was uneconomical and wouldn't go forward. There would have to be a higher level of exploitation, which would mean a higher risk of an oil spill. Let's see. So my advice there is to both respect the work of agency scientists and take the science seriously, but also to understand the limits of science. There's a lot we don't know. In particular, we have no idea how to clean up oil spills in ice-covered waters. Stewardship. I want to direct your attention to that little yellow dot. That little yellow dot represents a liquefied natural gas facility. As part of the environmental investigation to justify these leases, MMS made a very specific decision not to consider the effects of liquefied natural gas, even though Shell Oil, which was the major winner in the auction of leases, had said that they intended to develop a liquefied natural gas and a tankering facility. So all of the environmental work that went into justifying these leases was all based on a very inaccurate perception of what was actually going to happen. Hard to imagine that that could be good stewardship. Along the same lines, no consideration of the effects of global warming. I am out of time, so I'm going to skip over talking about that, just skip right to my advice, which was that the Obama administration must confront issues of both intergenerational and intragenerational, meaning environmental justice, implications of what it does, particularly in the Arctic, where those are so central. And transparency, I just want to show you, this is the response to a FOIA request that MMS listed about its internal dialogue about the effects of these leases on polar bears. Nothing. To, from, nothing else. PEER, which is an I don't know how to describe them, a scientific group of government employees has released the full email exchange, and it's a rather stark expression of scientific discontent with the political decision that was being made. So my advice is don't rely on secrecy to prevent embarrassment. Rely on good decision making. And finally, my overall advice is take this seriously. Right? Listen to the experts, but respect the limits of their expertise as well as the quality of their expertise. Right? Be a faithful steward of long-term interests. Don't compromise them for the short term. And welcome diverse points of view and provide as much information as possible and, in fact, cultivate information. Sorry, Mike.
Oh, we're good. Thank you very much. Jim?
Thanks, Mark. While we're waiting for the PowerPoint to kick up here, I want to thank Hari for inviting me here from over there. It's good to be here today and to hear everything that we've heard up to this point. Hopefully, I don't know what kind of... So the title for my talk, and I'm one of those people who likes to be able to see my slides as well, so I'm going to be constantly kind of moving here just a little bit and looking behind me so that I kind of have an idea of what I'm talking about. If we could get through this pretty quickly. I'm going to talk about this idea of internalizing the externalities of fuel choices. From that introductory title, you should recognize that I don't teach at law school. That I'm not aware. I'm an economist. And so I'm coming at this with a slightly different perspective, thinking about how the social science of economics applies to this area of climate change and climate policy, and then thinking about the one thing that we economists think we know, and that is that people respond to incentives. So I'm going to tell a little story about incentives here and thinking about behavioral change. So I thought I'd cut right to the chase. And dear President Obama, please join the Pagoo Club. That is my recommendation for the administration. How many of you know what the Pagoo Club is? There are like 4 people. All right, good. So I got a little bit of explaining to do here. Okay. I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail because I've mentioned this to a few people before. 10 minutes is about enough time for an economist to set up their assumptions just to get to their model. So I got to skip over a lot of things and cut to the chase here. The manifesto of the Pagoo Club and the members, and hopefully you'll recognize some of those names up there. I think some of the key ones are Larry Summers, who's a pretty big player right now, and a previous big player, Greg Mankiw. Greg is a professor at Harvard in the economics department who started the Pagoo Club, which is basically a group of wonkish economists and other policy-oriented people who are interested in using taxes to internalize externalities. Where does the idea come from? And again, sort of a history of economic thought and a little bit of theoretical background here. Arthur Pagoo is a British economist who wrote a book called The Economics of Welfare and developed this concept of externalities. And externalities, by definition, are costs imposed or benefits conferred on others that aren't taken into account by the individual who is behaving in this manner. So if I'm taking an action, I may be imposing cost or conferring benefits to you. If any of that is taking place, those would be considered externalities. Someone had mentioned earlier that the climate issue is a classic tragedy of the commons. It is a classic negative externality problem whereby our individual decisions are based upon, and I had to have a graph just to prove that I was an economist as well, are based upon that MPC curve, which is my marginal private cost. And so therefore, P1Q1, if this was the amount of gasoline that I was going to consume, would be based on the benefit that I think I derived from it, or the demand curve, and the private cost associated with producing and consuming that fuel. The idea behind the negative externality is that there are costs that are borne by others that I do not internalize, and that the true social costs of our use of commodities, fossil fuels in particular, that emit carbon and other pollutants, is that those social costs are much higher. And according to my picture here, the quantity that we are consuming should be lower, and the price, if in fact we're talking about efficiently allocating resources, the price should be higher. So how do we get there? The first step is for Obama to join the Pagoo Club, remember. I want to harp on this point that we talk about prices and that the price of things do not always reflect the cost associated with them. And that, by definition, is the negative externality that we just showed. So from a social standpoint, that cost per unit of fuel does not reflect the total cost to society of using that. And that is because, as you can read for yourself, it doesn't include the cost or the benefit with respect to carbon and other non-climate externalities from using a particular fuel. And I think the way that we need to think about fuel choices is what I like to call from extraction to exhaust. Okay, so whether we are talking about, and actually this next picture I think can summarize this, Mark DeLuchi at the University of California at Davis has developed a nice life cycle emissions model. He's a transportation economist, and so whether we're talking about that first exploration for oil or this first planting of the seed of corn all the way through vehicle operation and exhaust, there are emissions at every stage in this life cycle. So this is what's called the life cycle emissions model. And the attempt here would be to calculate the emissions at every level throughout this process. So one, that is a relatively large task to begin with from a scientific standpoint. Then where economics comes into play is in what I call the TADCOM, or the Total Acquisition and Dissipation Cost Model. And this is nothing new. It's just a schematic to express the way economists, including myself, are thinking about the full cost of energy acquisition and then how we benefit from that acquisition, in this particular case transportation fuels in the market, and then the cost associated with the dissipation, which in this particular case we're focusing on carbon dioxide, the emission of carbon dioxide. Obviously there are other pollutants as well, but the focus here is on climate change. There can be other environmental costs and other social costs as well that we might want to take into consideration, but the point here again is that the price of either gasoline or corn-based ethanol or bagasse-based ethanol or cellulosic ethanol, that price is not a true reflection of the cost associated, because there are acquisition costs that are external to the process, and there are energy dissipation costs as well, and that is primarily climate change. The other environmental concerns, which I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on, but just to let you know, these are some of the other things that should be considered. Land use change, water quantity, water quality, other GHGs. Obviously, carbon dioxide is not the only greenhouse gas. Local air quality, regional air quality, other considerations of that nature. And I think all of these are available online. So I just put a link to some work by David Zilberman at Berkeley, who has looked at some of these other costs. And so back to my initial story, my recommendation is to raise the gas tax. So Dr. Sayre from Berkeley stole my fire earlier by saying, this is really what we need to do. There's a great debate going on what sort of policy should be used to internalize the externality, the cap and trade versus a carbon tax. So whether it's going to be a quantity control or a price control. And I think that there are very good reasons to think across the spectrum of different combinations of cap and trade and gas tax. The simplicity of the gas tax is what I am arguing for, to simply put a price on those negative externalities. The idea behind the cap and trade, it is not fundamentally flawed in any way, shape, or form. I'm actually probably theoretically more inclined to think about cap and trade as the alternative, but I think from a practical standpoint, cap and trade is going to be very, very difficult to implement, to process. I think that there are going to be huge problems in terms of it'll be like another financial instrument out there, which will become susceptible to different types of market manipulation. The gentleman earlier who spoke about U.S.-China relations and mentioned the fact that markets, right, market orientation is a rather new development. In order for cap and trade to work, market orientation has to be fundamentally ingrained. There is no alternative to that. Whereas just a clear price signal that is dictated by the tax is very straightforward. Again, there's some great debate going on about whether or not we should think about a gas tax or cap and trade. I have moved recently towards thinking that a gas tax is probably the way to go. However, very recently, President Obama said he won't even consider a gas tax at this point in time, which is why, once again, my policy recommendation is join the Pagoo Club. Larry Summers, who apparently has his ear, right, is highly in favor of a tax over a cap and trade. Paul Krugman, Jeffrey Sachs, several others who don't have his ear, much more in favor of a tax rather than cap and trade, again, for the simplicity arguments, not necessarily for anything on the efficiency side. These are just some back-of-the-envelope calculations. The marginal social cost of a ton of carbon dioxide basically estimated anywhere from $3 to $150 a ton. Right? That'll give you an idea of some of the uncertainty associated with what are the damages associated from emitting carbon. So I went with just a couple of round numbers to give you an indication of if we had a tax of either $100 or $50 a ton, what the revenue generation might be. And my suggestion, my final suggestion would be, that's actually a link to a paper that talks about raising the gas tax and lowering the payroll tax, so that potentially offsetting some of the income effects. This is another paper from Resources for the Future. Again, if you're interested later, you could go check this out, talking about the difference between price and quantity controls. And so my final thoughts are to use economic incentives. Someone mentioned earlier it's not just carrots and sticks, and clearly it's not, but carrots and sticks matter. And so one of the issues in biofuel development right now is sort of where to subsidize and where to tax. And I think it has to be as close to the externality as possible, is one of my suggestions. So on the carrots, or excuse me, on the stick side, penalizing bad behavior as close to the source as possible. On the carrot side, what I have up there is subsidized riparian forest buffers and not the blending of biofuels. Because the blending of biofuels does not address potentially all of the environmental changes, but rather, if you can subsidize the planting of riparian forest buffers on farms to mitigate some of the environmental change, then you're getting closer to thinking about the positive and the negative externality. And lastly, and I hope we'd all be in favor of this, is to use some of that gas tax revenue to fund R&D at universities. So,
That sounds good.
thank you.
Okay, our next speaker is Professor David Markell from FSU. So I gather, Hari, we just wait?
Yeah, you should come up momentarily.
Great.
Chuck already established contact.
David, are you there?
I am, yep. Am I on?
You are on.
Okay.
Visual.
Well, thanks very much. I'm Dave Markell. Can you hear me?
Yep.
We can hear
Yes.
you.
Okay. So as I ended, you're looking at my picture from the website on the screen. So I've never appeared before people this way before. But I will say I went to DC about months ago, ran into a girlfriend. She told me that she was afraid to get together in person again because she had seen my picture on the website and thought I looked old. So anyway, we had time together later. So I apologize for kind of interacting with you in this way. And really appreciate Harry's invited me to participate in March, and also want to thank the students. Chuck Gates has been awesome in helping me to navigate my way around Skype. So Chuck, thanks very much. And Jennifer Lynn was very helpful in setting this up too. Anyway, I'm going to try to make 3 points from in this 10 minutes or so from this paper I'm doing called at least 10 of Greening the Economy Sustainably. It's very much a work in progress, so feel free to keep away if there's an opportunity for questions later. And then Mark, I guess you're moderating, so I've got my watch off, and I'm trying to monitor my time. But if it looks like I won't be offended at all. Okay.
David, I will, via the chat function, this is Chuck, I will type to you how many minutes you have.
Okay, good.
But only starting when there's 3 minutes left.
Only
Don't
when
worry.
there's 3 minutes left, when you're near completion.
Okay, perfect. I'll try to do that. I'll try to compartmentalize and watch the crowd and watch the screen too. Anyway, my 3 points are first, as the tentative title of the paper reflects, and this is kind of a conceptual point, the title signals that basically what I'm interested in trying to do in this paper is to look for sustainable ways to green our economy. And so the first task I thought would be to describe or explain a little bit on in terms of what I mean by that. To talk just for a minute or so about the concept of sustainable development and what that means, at least for purposes of this presentation. So for that, there's a question, well, what does greening the economy to be sustainably mean? What does sustainable development mean? I'm going to borrow from the definition of sustainable development that's, I think, if I'm understanding it correctly, that's embraced in the new Lifeblood agenda for a sustainable America that John Durban from Widener has edited. And John basically suggests there are two key elements to the definition of sustainable development. First, it's important to understand the word development, which is a word that sustainable modifies. And basically, as the term development is understood internationally, it includes three key elements. First, economic element, under natural, but then also the idea of peace and security and the idea of human rights. And so the goal of development is supposed to encompass or embrace all three of those objectives. One, economic development, two, peace and security, and three, human rights. And then with Rio back in '92 and Stockholm Conference, before that, people started talking about sustainable development. So the question of, well, what does the word sustainable add to the word development? And it basically adds the idea that environmental protection and restoration ought to be superimposed on the international system's overall goals of economic development, peace and security, and human rights. And so sustainable development basically recognizes that these historical goals of development ought to continue to be our ultimate objective, so we're not in any way moving away from those. But instead, environmental degradation is no longer supposed to be the price of progress. Instead, environmental protection and restoration should be part of what progress means. So the basic, so where am I coming from in trying to paint this little conceptual picture? Well, the basic idea is that, and those of you who have taken environmental law before are familiar with NEPA, and so this is part and parcel of the entire NEPA approach. Basic idea is that it's not enough to look at environmental consequences alone and looking for climate solutions. It's not enough to look at those environmental consequences in a vacuum. Instead, what policymakers need to do is they need to pay attention to a range of factors that include environmental protection, but also include other factors like economic development and national security. And so that broad, very integrated focus provides a frame, if you will, for thinking about climate solutions that we'll want to consider in this country that we hope will be sustainable down the road. So that's point one, is trying to just kind of establish a frame for this paper conceptually by talking about sustainable development or greening the economy sustainably and what that means conceptually. All right, so moving to point two, now moving from the abstract, the conceptual, to the very practical. Point two involves the world of technology and science. And to me, this a second key step in trying to green the economy sustainably is to do foundational, what I guess characterize as foundational work of identifying and evaluating climate solution options for reducing emissions. So what are the options that potentially are available to us as a society to reduce our emissions and do something about climate change? Well, the good news here, at least to me, and I'm not a scientist, I'm not a full expert, but my sense is that a lot of people are working very hard on that issue and those kinds of foundational questions. And so I thought I'd point to a couple of concrete examples of some of the work that's come out in the last year or so that I think is essentially is quite helpful in moving us forward in this foundational arena of identifying viable strategies for achieving reductions in a way that's sustainable. So one of them is a McKinsey & Company report from December '07. It's got a long title, but the first part of the title is Reducing U.S. Greenhouse Gas Emissions, How Much at What Cost? And what McKinsey does in this report is it analyzes more than 250 different opportunities to reduce or prevent greenhouse gas emissions. The options range from using different kinds of energy generation strategies, so wind energy, biomass, etc., to different options for increasing efficiency, upgrades in lighting, that sort of thing, to absorption possibilities such as afforestation. So the main deliverable, if you will, from the McKinsey report is a set of abatement curves in which McKinsey tries to provide estimates of the cost of reducing emissions using these different strategies. Let's see here. I think no check from you. 3 minutes left. Okay. I saw the blinking. So, all right, thanks. So, anyway, so McKinsey's looked at online. McKinsey's looked at these 250 options for reducing emissions. It's an abatement curve to try to get a sense of the cost of pursuing each of these different emissions. And the findings seem quite promising to me. Basically, McKinsey concludes that it's possible to reduce emissions dramatically with existing technologies or technologies that will be available soon at a very reasonable cost. In fact, it says that almost 40% abatement could be achieved at negative marginal costs, meaning that investing in these options would generate positive economic returns in fairly short order. So there seems to be a lot of foundational work going on to identify and evaluate different options for achieving reductions that I think will be very helpful to the Obama administration and everybody else in trying to find the best way forward. And a second set of issues that is important to think about in dealing with climate solution options is to look beyond the kind of the McKinsey and Company abatement curves to look at other factors that might motivate feds, state governments, and others to consider different approaches for climate, for avoiding climate change, or at least for mitigating the emissions that we're all worried about. And so I wanted to just kind of touch briefly on one of those kinds of options, and it involves something called or known as supply chains. And basically, there's a lot of work going on right now, not only to look at, well, what are the different options for reducing emissions, but also to look at the supply chains for those options. So what do I mean by supply chains? Well, supply chains are basically include a manufacturing process used to develop different approaches to climate change options. And I think that I have 1 minute left. Okay. And so let me give you, especially for the students out there, there's a very helpful report that Duke did at the end of 2008 called Manufacturing Climate Solutions. And what Duke does in that report, Duke's Center on Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness, issued a 2008 report where it looks not only at the abatement curve, but it also looks at supply chain to try to figure out, well, which are the options available to us that have the potential to produce significant amounts of employment and economic growth, etc., because we make those kinds of goods in particular parts of the country. And so one of the businesses that studies a North Carolina lighting company called CREE, C-R-E-E Inc. It makes very advanced lighting materials. Its lighting materials were used in China as part of the recent Olympics. And it has basically quadrupled its workforce since 2002 because it's making lighting fixtures that are very effective in reducing emissions in a way that's attractive throughout the world. So that's what the Duke Center does. It tries to identify different opportunities for different parts of the country to pick climate solutions that will not only be effective in reducing emissions, but also be effective in growing the economy. So those are two of my points. I have one more point involving institutional governance, but Mark, of course, it's a fascinating and profoundly important point. But I think what sounds like about time is I'll just stop there, and if anybody has questions about that, I'll be happy to deal with that during the Q&A. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you. Well, that technology works very well, Noah.
Before you start, David, if you can still hear me, we're going to keep you live so that you're still online for questions and answers.
Oh, terrific. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, everyone. First, I just want to thank our hosts and also the students. One thing I want to do is congratulate you on the new journal. I think it's a great venture, a new startup. And by titling it the Journal of Energy, Climate, and the Environment, I think you're drawing all the right connections between the climate issue is, after all, an energy issue at its core. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The role of energy consumption in U.S. climate strategy in the Obama administration. And I should say, with full disclosure, that I served on the Energy and Environment Policy Committee for the campaign, though I'm not currently affiliated with the administration. When I get a sense of public debates over climate change, it seems like most of the attention is on the supply side of energy. It's about greening the energy supply. It's about renewables. It's about biofuels. It's about wind and solar. A lot on carbon sequestration. And I see far less attention being paid to the demand side of the energy equation. It's almost as if we take rising energy demand as a given, and then we try to meet that demand with greener or less carbon-intensive forms of supply. So what I want to do today is two main points. First, I want to show why energy efficiency and conservation are not just important for the U.S. climate strategy, but need to be the core of the strategy, the leading plank, especially in the near term, let's say the next 5 to 10 years. I think that the U.S. should set a goal of a 10% reduction in overall U.S. energy consumption by 2016 and a 15% reduction by 2020. And just for some terminology, I use the terms energy efficiency and energy conservation. I'll use both of them in this talk. They're very different. And energy efficiency, of course, is a much more pleasing sounding word. Everyone likes efficiency. But I think that the U.S. strategy needs to combine both. Just to give an example of how I'm using the terms, if we swapped out incandescent lights with fluorescent lights in this room, that would be an efficiency measure. You're getting the same lighting with less energy inputs. But if we did things like motion sensors in the room, then that's a conservation measure. You're actually using less energy because you just don't need the lights on when you're not here. The second thing I want to do in my talk today is to talk about the stimulus bill that passed last Friday and what that contains for energy efficiency measures. First, a little background on energy trends. There's good news and bad news here. This is a chart of energy intensity of the U.S. economy, the purple line, and you can see that it's been going down for decades. And President Bush latched onto this by saying in 2002 that he pledged to lower the greenhouse gas intensity of the U.S. economy by 18% in 10 years, and lo and behold, it's going to happen. With almost no policy intervention, he's riding that trend line of energy intensity declining. So we are getting more efficient at producing GDP with fewer energy inputs. The bad news is that the absolute amount of energy we consume in the U.S. has been rising for decades. We've doubled the amount of coal that we consume since 1978. Someone mentioned earlier we're up 17% in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990. And of course, the atmosphere doesn't care about ratios. The atmosphere doesn't care about the ratio of energy to GDP. The atmosphere cares or responds to absolute levels of emissions. If you look at this on a per capita basis, we are clearly the leading energy hogs on the planet. This one's not even close. This is U.S. per capita energy consumption versus other countries. And we're roughly double our peers, industrial nations. And the point here is that gap between the 341 and the other numbers should be viewed as an opportunity, as a resource for us, almost as a mineable resource. You can have energy savings that could replace the need for new coal mining or new oil drilling. And I don't mean to offend Californians here by calling it a foreign country, but California is on this list because California is, I think, ranked first or second in terms of per capita energy use, in terms of their efficiency of energy. So this also opens a tremendous opportunity for the United States. If all of us could learn to live with the per capita energy use that Californians live with, and they're a pretty prosperous state, at least until 2 or 3 weeks ago. If we could all live like Californians, that's a 30% drop in per capita energy use. Also likely approximately a 30% drop in greenhouse gas emissions. So that's pretty significant. So this is why I think that energy efficiency and conservation need to be the core planks of U.S. climate strategy. The first is cost. As David just mentioned, this McKinsey report that came out in 2007 lined up all the U.S. greenhouse gas abatement opportunities. And the ones that were the cheapest tended to be in the energy efficiency space. Things like better building insulation, better building codes, better lighting, home weatherization. And McKinsey found that a lot of these efficiency opportunities could be had at negative cost, at a net savings to the economy. And I can talk a little bit more in Q&A if you want about why, if efficiency is so great, why doesn't the market achieve it on its own? Why do we need government policies? But the opportunities are out there. The second issue, and I think this is the biggest one, is speed. If you look at the big carbon neutral or less carbon intensive sources of energy supply, they're still a decade or more away. Renewables, wind and solar are ramping up very fast, but they're starting from a small base. The U.S. Energy Information Agency predicts that in 2030, coal will still be the dominant energy source in the U.S. in 2030, absent any new major changes in policy. Nuclear, we've all heard about the nuclear renaissance that's coming, and the NRC predicts it's going to receive 34 new license applications by next year. But those plants are not going to be up and running until 2020 at the earliest. And then in terms of carbon sequestration, even the electric utilities now are saying that it's not going to be practicable on a large scale until 2020. So that's why I think in the near term, next decade or so, the climate change strategy has to be an efficiency strategy. And then we all know about greenhouse gas reductions. Well, I think what's often overlooked is the benefits for conventional pollutant reductions if we can reduce our energy use in terms of avoiding construction of new coal plants and reduced vehicle emissions. Okay, so what does the stimulus package do? It has a mix of tax incentives and direct spending. The big energy tax incentives are for R&D, some of it related to fossil fuels, but the two big ones related to efficiency in particular are $2 billion in tax credits for purchases of plug-in hybrids and $2 billion in credits for purchases of Energy Star qualified home appliances and insulation and so on. And that's up to $1,500 a year. This is some big money. It's something I'm going to look into for my own house. Mass transit was a big winner in the bill. $8 billion for construction of high-speed rail, trying to get those tracks, especially in the Northeast Corridor, up to a level where they can handle higher-speed trains, and $8.4 billion for mass transit funding for the states and localities. And here's the big money, $50 billion for energy programs. Huge, huge. Energy is a big winner in the stimulus bill. Stephen Chu, the new Secretary of Energy, I think just had his budget tripled or quadrupled in his first 2 weeks in office, which is a good start for a new cabinet secretary. And about $20 billion of it directly targeted at energy efficiency measures. Particularly improvements in federal buildings, smart grid technologies, and these block grants to state and local government. So the big question is, will any of this make a difference? And I think it will at the margins. I think this should be considered a big victory for the environmental community. I think it fulfills a lot of President Obama's campaign pledges. And of course, the devil is in the details. I spent part of this week going through the bill. And there's some very smart things in there, like for the block grants to states, those are conditioned on governors certifying that within 8 years, 90% of their new construction, commercial and residential, will comply with sort of state-of-the-art energy efficiency building codes. So we will now have essentially a federal energy efficiency building code, not directly passed by the federal government, but stimulated through the stimulus package. And then there are some open questions about the smart grid. For instance, will that be spent on smart metering, where you'd be able to see your daily energy use and the current price of electricity in your home? Or is it going to be spent just on transmission upgrades? So lots of open questions there. But overall, I think this is a very promising start. It's not the full agenda, though. And one of the interesting political battles right now is going to be to see whether this bill, which is so massive, is going to be the signature domestic accomplishment of the Obama administration, or is it going to be followed on by several other energy-related packages or healthcare packages and so on. And we're going to get a preview of that in a few weeks when President Obama unveils his FY10 budget. What I'm hoping for is increased attention to things like performance standards for cars and buildings, increased reliance on information and labeling programs like smart metering, and we need big new changes in utility regulation, which is primarily at the state level here in the U.S., to provide utilities with an incentive, an economic incentive to earn money off efficiency improvements. And the last thing, of course, is cap and trade. I think nothing would do more to reduce energy consumption in the U.S. than a cap and trade bill. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Our last speaker is Professor Marcelin Burke from Houston.
Good afternoon. I am happy to be here as well, and thank you to the Journal and the Environmental Law Society, and of course, Pari, for giving me a chance to talk to you a little bit about my latest research project, which is a continuation of my efforts to develop and explore the contours of the public's interest in the conservation of natural resources, and in particular, in view of private property rights to develop land. And the focus here is obviously on large-scale solar energy plants on federal land. And in this context, I'm talking very familiar concepts that we're very familiar with about the bundle of sticks and, the right to use and preserve and exclude and, transfer lands and all of that. And while that bundle of sticks metaphor is critical to my vision here, it's not sufficient to complete this task. And so it may be necessary to recast property, to view it as a web of interest, as Tony Arnold has written about quite compellingly, as well as this bundle of sticks. We might need something a little more complicated than the abstraction that we've all grown to love and know and love. And so here I'm trying to probe the interplay between the public rights and the private rights that will be conferred through these permits to develop solar energy on public lands. And so in the United States, as in most of the world, this competition for resources arises because of legislative mandates, the Energy Policy Act, the Executive Order Renewable Portfolio Standards, the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007, a less well-known measure. And then, of course, the Obama administration has set as one of its priorities to reduce the country's dependence on imports of oil from the Middle East and Venezuela. And, he was just in Canada yesterday, and that's actually where we get most of our oil, but we'll save that discussion for a different day. But that also the agenda for us to have 10% of our electricity come from renewable sources by 2012 and 25% of that to come by 2025. So obviously the development of solar energy on public lands is going to be critical to achieving these goals. And so since 2005, energy developers seeking to build these projects have filed approximately 223 applications for right-of-way permits with the Department of Interior's Bureau of Land Management, BLM. And these projects are concentrated in Arizona, California, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, and Utah, with the bulk of them being in Southern California, Nevada, and Arizona. And these projects would cover, well, the BLM manages a lot of land. In case those of us on the East Coast oftentimes aren't really as acutely aware of the fact that BLM manages about 250 million acres of land, and about 119 million of those acres are in those states that I just mentioned. And of that, about 1 million acres of land are the subject of those permit applications. That will supply about 70 billion watts of power, which is enough to power about 20 million homes, I think. So, you know, just to give you a sense of the scale of these projects, they're pretty big. They can require anywhere from 2 to 10 acres of land for each megawatt of power. And so this is just an example, and I'll show you quickly. Since it's the afternoon, pictures are good, right? So show you some pretty pictures of different types of technology. But so here we are. We've decided this is what we're going to do. There's no sort of are we going to do this or not. So the tough questions are how and where are we going to cite these projects. And there are a number of environmental law statutes that we're all familiar with as well that are going to govern that development. But I'm also really more so interested in looking at some foundational or guiding principles for this development. So we know that, you know, we have this sort of modern day gold rush, as it were, to develop right now, and that gold rush, or that rush, carries with it the risk of overexploitation of natural resources in the public lands, thereby permanently impairing the rights of current and future generations. Now, not surprisingly, a variety of stakeholders are weighing in on the appropriate allocation of the resources. And one thing that I want to do through this analysis or this account is to point out that the public claims nor the private nor private claims will be monolithic. Indeed, these are going to be complex, varied, nuanced, and then actually connected claims. So just briefly, sort of what's going on right now is that the BLM is engaged in some NEPA analysis, a programmatic EIS, the PICE. And I know that when I was not here this morning, Hari mentioned that today is my birthday, but she probably didn't mention that NEPA and I are both celebrating 40 years of existence this year. So it's appropriate that I be looking at NEPA this go round. And so we're looking at it in the 6-stage region. We're going to look at the programmatic, a broad assessment for the region. And this is where they're going to look at sort of generally the environmental and natural resources impacts, and then develop some environmental policies and mitigation strategies to apply in their assessment of the permit applications. We anticipate completing this by next spring, but in the meantime, they're using the 2007 solar energy development policy. So in the usual sense, we have NEPA and the environmental impact statements. I'm also concerned about public participation at this point, and it's really, I see it as an opportunity. While there are challenges to getting lots of people involved at different levels, as Stephanie sort of outlined some of the ways we need to do that this morning, but that's going to be very important here in formulating this vision of property that I have. And then under FLPMA, of course, under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act, BLM has to develop these resource management plans that provide the framework to guide the decisions for every action and approved use on its lands. And so while the PICE provides sort of an overview of the environmental analysis, it's still going to be that RMP where we make those site-specific analyses and decisions. Now, unfortunately, the BLM's track record with RMPs and the development of traditional energy resources is far from encouraging for those of us who are concerned about public property rights. And there's been a lot of litigation about the BLM's RMPs. Indeed, SUA, the Southern Utah Wilderness Association, has announced its intention to sue over the RMPs that cover the land where the leases in Utah, where Secretary Salazar just canceled those leases. They're like, that's great. Now we can get to the really fundamental problem here is the lack of analysis and protection of those public rights through the RMPs. So with respect to energy development, I would argue that BLM has consistently put on some pretty thick blinders when it comes to protecting the public's property rights. And that resolution of this litigation and others that are sure to follow will tell us a lot about what's going to happen with respect to this administration. So, you know, in addition to the BLM's less than steward-like compliance with FLPMA, there's also concern about the potential conflict between private, vested, or valid existing rights. And the fact that the BLM has said, well, we're not really going to look at how those rights might impact natural resources and the fact that we're going to have this increased use or impact on natural resources. So I'm not really sure how that works out, that we're going to pretend as if these things aren't really related. But what I want to, where I really am starting to think about this, as I said, was how do I put together this very popular notion of property rights as a discrete bundle of rights or sticks, and this idea of there being a web of connectedness, our relationship with each other, our relationship with the resource, and how we decide how we should be managing them. And so I think it's great that Rebecca started us off talking about this idea about trust and stewardship, because that's where I think that's where we need to be going. And I think we have a great opportunity to get beyond all this that we're very familiar with. Don't want to discard it, very much central to what we're talking about here. But that we move into thinking about some other issues. The public trust doctrine, we talk about it all the time, but what does it really mean right now? And I think we have an awesome opportunity. JB told us to wait and not sue the agency, but somehow we've got to engage the agency while the iron is hot. And talk about these doctrines, these principles of how we might avoid the failings that we've had in the past with respect to races to develop natural resources in this country. And hopefully that through this work I can help the administration balance the desire and the need to develop renewable energy, as well as the desire, the duty, the obligation to protect natural resources. So with that, I'm going to stop and say what an awesome time that we're living in. We have an extraordinary opportunity to engage the citizenry and to capture its imagination, really, about what role we should be playing as stewards of these resources. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, with Marshall's great optimism, let's open the floor. We've got about 20 minutes, so why don't we take a couple of questions, and then perhaps we can have each of the panelists respond, or is that a good approach? Are we all comfortable with that? Yep, Guy.
I'd like to direct one question to the comments on the panel. And the question being, with respect to the gas leaks, what is your response to the obvious argument that a negative externality that's going to come out of that is going to be the social implications on especially the upper low class to the lower middle class, and that they're going to be the most negatively affected by it because historically they're going to be driving the automobiles that have the worst fuel efficiency, and therefore be placed in an even worse economic situation.
Sure. First, I think that it's a red herring. That would be number one. I think that comes up immediately in this discussion about a concern over poverty in the lower class when in other areas it's completely ignored. So first off, I think that my inclination is to not necessarily take that very seriously on the surface, but I do take it very seriously from a policy perspective. The idea would be to reduce payroll taxes, which are the most regressive taxes that we have right now. And there's just a great slogan from the Gund Institute at the University of Vermont called "Tax bads, not goods. So why is it that we place this regressive burden on middle income and lower middle income households by taxing them for their work when we could tax away a negative externality and then enhance work opportunities by reducing that tax burden? That in conjunction with some of the stimulus package, for example, which might provide a tax rebate even further, like an earned income tax credit for replacing your older vehicle. So I think that there are a lot of ways that you can respond to that regressive nature of that tax by reducing other tax burdens. And I think that you have to. I would add that as well.
Any of the other panelists want to tread on that question or jump on it?
Yeah, I would. I guess one frustrating thing for me, at least, about that particular line of questioning is it assumes what exists is somehow normalized and neutral. And any change of it produces externalities. And I mean, I think your point is right. There are a tremendous number of decisions that we make that have negative externalities, particularly on those of us who are socially most vulnerable. And we make them, and yet we only discuss their plight when we're talking about changing existing structures.
So I'd be curious, this panel in many ways was mostly focusing on a larger scale than the previous two. And I'd be curious how you think some of the state and local implementation and preemption questions that we were talking about in the panel before should be handled in the context of the energy policy issues you were discussing.
Yeah, sure. I think what I didn't get into and where I think perhaps state and local law will bear most heavily is with respect to transmission issues and whether or not, how we're going to go about moving all, this energy from the deserts of California and Arizona to the people that actually need them. And that is, and as I said, there are a variety of stakeholders weighing in, and many of those are state and local governments that are concerned about how this is going to, one, impair their own property rights, and also the ways in which the states and local governments will have to mitigate the impacts that are actually going to occur on federal land and have an impact off. So I think it bears to, your idea of vertical, longitudinal. We've got to go in a lot of different directions, and that is all quite connected. And so while, yes, I'm focusing on what's happening on the federal land, there's absolutely no doubt that we have to look at that larger picture and look in a lot of different directions.
Well, I think the Alaska example, to some extent, highlights a contradiction that didn't come out quite as much in the first two panels, and that is that local interests often can work against the national interests and work against the international interests. And there's a temptation to valorize local solutions that sometimes I think the communities in the states are in the vanguard and they're ahead of where the federal and the international are. But it's also true that local concentrated interests can work against a national and international response to climate change. I think Alaska's a great example of that.
And I would say on the energy consumption issues, there's a huge role for local government because so much of our energy consumption, especially in transportation, is driven by land use. So if we look at why European nations per capita consumption is so much lower, well, one reason is more compact cities and more use of mass transit.
Yes, sir. So this is a question for Noah, and also it raises sort of a question about the McKinsey report. It's actually a comment and also a question, and that is everybody always talks about how fluorescent lighting lasts so much longer, and I've yet to purchase a fluorescent light bulb in many years of buying these lamps that actually last much longer than a regular light bulb. And I wanted to ask the TV representative as to what I was doing wrong, and they looked at me and they thought at one point that I was buying some other brand of light bulb, but I went back and checked. And so it raises a larger question of whether, at least in my mind as a practical consumer, what truth is really to some of these claims. But the question here that I have specifically is, I've looked at that McKinsey report, and one of the questions that I don't really understand, and it's in part because I'm not sure I understand the methodology of the McKinsey report sufficiently. And I'm curious whether you have, or any other panelists have great familiarity. This idea that we have activities or opportunities to reduce energy that have a negative cost, right? Efficiency, conservation. Yet, of course, one of the answers, and I assume that, tell me if you disagree, but the reason why they don't get taken advantage of is because of collective action problem, transaction costs, and all those other things. And that really begs the question in many respects, in the sense that the social problem that we're trying to solve isn't only global warming, but rather all the activities that are necessary to solve that. And so if you ignore the transaction costs that are necessary to address that problem, aren't you miscalculating? I mean, this sort of goes back to actually, I'm sorry, this idea of life cycle costs of any kind of product, right? I mean, I was going to follow up with a question also. What I would be curious about is, what the life cycle cost is not only of biofuels, but really of photovoltaic cells. And the problem that producing photovoltaics, requires a lot of chemicals, actually. That there's a lot of other so if you put it all together, how much good are we really doing? And so, I mean, it's really sort of a question here as to how honest that kind of analysis really is. I don't know whether you have a good answer to that or not.
I'll stab at both your questions, because I think there's a link between that. And the link, I think, is culture. So to go first to the fluorescent bulb issue. I don't know what bulbs you're buying. I don't know about technical aspects. But the compact fluorescents have been around for a decade now, and studies show that the uptake of them, despite their lower life cycle costs, is pretty low. One reason is consumers don't like the light, and it can make faces look sort of ghostly, which is a pretty important thing if you're lighting your home. So there's a cultural aspect, cultural resistance to making that change. And with the McKinsey report, I think it's true, of course, if you're not considering transaction costs, then you're not measuring the real costs of efficiency gains. But I think there's a lot of reasons we don't do even well understood efficiency gains that have nothing to do with transaction costs. For instance, it might just be that most firms don't have someone employed who focuses on finding energy efficiency gains to be had in that firm. It might also be just an informational problem, that consumers aren't very well informed about what any given appliance in their home uses or how much electricity they're using at any given time. So I think those things are hurdles that could be addressed at very minimal cost.
If I could jump on that idea very, very quickly, the idea that there'd be a negative cost and why wouldn't people do it? It seems irrational, right? So if there's a win-win out there and we don't do it. But I think it is, to echo on what you were saying, it's an asymmetric information problem. And clearly markets only work and you only have efficient market clearing when you avoid the asymmetric information problem. I just built a house, okay? I'm building a house, and it is painful to get people to do things that are in the best interest of building the house. There's this hysteresis of this is the way things have always been done, and a lack of information about even the financial benefits of R26 versus R13 in your walls. So I think asymmetry in information is a huge issue, and one that the market will continue to fail until we address that asymmetric information problem.
Can I just follow up with you on that? I take your point is, I think, well taken to some extent. So if you have industrial enterprises where you can hire somebody, that really ought to be a cost of business that a well-managed company really should include. But this problem of simply saying that it's an information asymmetry, again, I think oversimplifies this question. I mean, you're suggesting that it is just a matter of telling somebody, this is better than the other. But the reality in real life is that it's not just one question of information that we're looking at. It's thousands and thousands of items of information. And so that kind of there is a reason to why there's information asymmetry, in that it requires time and effort. And so I'm not suggesting that, this is, I'm not suggesting there aren't opportunities there, but I guess what I'm trying to get at is that I find the analyses that I see so oversimplified often. I mean, this is why I don't understand the McKinsey report rate. I cannot distinguish whether somebody's really sort of taking the time to identify things that should be part of ordinary, where I would characterize it maybe just ordinary mistake, mismanagement that results in inefficiencies that can be easily remedied, versus, I think, our structural problems with the availability of information, the problem of acquiring and understanding information, that are, I think, much, much more difficult to overcome, and that really require time and effort and cost. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing, but I guess I don't understand a lot of the analysis. It seems to me oversimplified oftentimes.
If I could just add one thing, that is that the part I didn't really get to talk about in terms of transparency is trying to capture some of what you're bringing out, Celine, in terms of there are reasons, not only are there reasons for informational asymmetries, but there's also a lot of different and sometimes conflicting information, not because one set of information is good and one set of information is bad, but because they're looking at the same question through a different set of lenses, prioritizing a different set of values. And that's got to be part of any discussion about information and about transparency, a recognition that values are shaping the discourse.
Yes.
I just wanted to kind of go back, kind of the question that Hari had mentioned, and notice your response. When I was in my presentation, I raised a concern that a policy focused primarily on energy efficiency and conservation could end up with a lot of sprawl with people in energy-efficient McMansions driving their hybrid vehicles, right? And we sort of see that in some ways, right? That we get trade-offs as we move towards what might be viewed as more sustainable along one dimension, where actually people are trading that off towards more unsustainable activity in another dimension. And so I just wondered if, I know in your response you said, well, then there's land use. And so do you sort of see this as a piece of something bigger, or are we really going to get to where we want to with energy efficiency and conservation?
I think energy efficiency is just one piece of the climate change strategy, and I think it's a very big one. And so I don't mean to say that we look at energy efficiency to the exclusion of land use or to the exclusion of carbon neutral sources of supply. On the role of energy efficiency and land use, boy, I haven't given much thought to those connections. It seems to me that if you had energy efficiency measures in place, in addition to a cap and trade system that raised the price of gasoline, or a gas tax for that matter, that you might get the land use changes that you desire for other grounds.
Yeah, I think that when we talked about in our earlier panel about a gas tax being something that would stimulate consumer demand for more sustainable land use activities.
Sure. Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, for Professor Casey, I was wondering why you were advocating a gasoline tax as opposed to, for instance, a carbon tax or a climate forcing potential tax, which might capture a larger category of products. Second, whether you would advocate extending a tax to the international level, for instance, in the current negotiations. And third, how you would propose to deal with the estimated $250 billion that non-OECD countries spend to subsidize energy consumption in their countries every year.
All right, so one, carbon tax, yeah, I think across the board carbon tax is the way to go. So it's tons of carbon. I was just translating it into a fuel tax because of the title of my talk, which was focused on transportation fuel. But yeah, clearly, and I think this actually gets at the land use McMansions hybrids thing, is that your electricity gets taxed for the same rate of carbon emissions as your fuel does. So that sort of brings those two issues into place. The second one, on an international level, I think that the mechanisms are in place already to think about taxation versus creating a new instrument, a new market, which is marketable permits. So I think that the infrastructure is in place internationally for countries to think about how they want to price carbon. And again, it's going to depend on the elasticity of demand for whatever those particular products are, how consumers will respond to that price increase. So it gives flexibility to each individual, to the sovereign nation. The other thing that I've seen, Joe Stiglitz has suggested that through the WTO, if you don't internalize your externalities, then you're basically you're dumping into other countries by passing off the externalities, and so therefore that should have trade implications if you don't internalize the externalities. So do it through your own mechanism of a tax, or WTO will be the group that mitigates that, whether or not you're actually bearing the full cost of your production. The third piece was the subsidization of energy use.
Particularly by developing countries at the consumer level.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough one. It also applies to some other work that I do looking at water rights and the price of water and so on. And here you have issues of equity coupled with efficiency, and those create, I think, difficult questions. I think before we start looking at the subsidization of energy in non-OECD countries, we need to talk about the subsidization of agriculture, et cetera, in the OECD countries, because otherwise we have no ground to stand on there. So I wouldn't even go that far yet until we actually talked about the subsidies for our own consumption of food and fuel before we went to non-OECD countries. Did that get all three?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does David want to jump in on anything? David, do you want to jump? It's Mark Drumble here. Do you want to jump in on any of these questions at any point?
Can you hear me, Mark?
Yes, we all can.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for asking. I've been listening and following the discussion, and I'll chime in if as I think appropriate. But I think the questions have been great, and I think the answers have been pretty responsive. So I'm happy to listen.
You're a moderator's delight. Everything's happy. We've got 4 more minutes. Does anyone else want to jump in? Yes?
Yeah, this is mostly for Professor Sachs, I think. A couple of pieces of information. There's a bill in the General Assembly right now, I'm not sure whether it's died yet or still going, that sets a goal of 19% production of electricity use by something like 2025. Just as a benchmark that we're talking about. There's also another one that does allow for utilities to get cost recovery for energy efficiency measures. Those are two that come up that I think are interesting. I think that latter one is moving forward. But the question I had was, you see those numbers cited frequently of per capita energy use in the United States, and the number that I never really see that I want to ask about is per capita energy use on something like units of production, because the United States produces a ton of economic activity, but which is really the measure we're talking about, it seems to me. So, and it brings up another point about that. When we talk about California versus the rest of the country, there are parts of the country where certain economic activities are going to be more energy intensive or less than California. So it seems like that per capita measure doesn't really, in some ways, misses what we need to be thinking about to move forward. And so, like, comment.
So the better measure then would be energy per unit of GDP, per unit of production.
At least it seems like that is one that we ought to talk about at the same time, especially when we're comparing countries.
Yes, and I didn't put those numbers up, but the U.S. is higher in those numbers than many EU countries, and certainly compared to Japan. So that other countries are able to produce more output per unit of energy input than we are.
Is the disparity as much as that per capita one?
I would have to go look at those numbers again. And with California, some people dismiss the California number because, well, the climate's better. They're not using a lot of natural gas for heating and so on.
But people who have looked at the California situation pretty closely say that that's only a tiny portion of what makes California lower energy consuming. It has to do a lot with policies they've implemented since the 70s.
Any other panelists? Jim?
Sort of two things along those lines. One, that energy use per GDP, dollar output, you did have a slide up there that showed that it's decreasing over time. But I do think that's a misleading one. And you used it in a domestic sense that in different places of the country, different things are being produced. Part of the reason that energy use per dollar output is going down is because we're a service sector, not a manufacturing. So this is actually, I think, going to be one of the interesting things in the international climate arena. And the question I would pose is, who's responsible for China's CO2 emissions? Is it ultimately the consumers of the products or the producers of the products, or somewhere in the middle? Because I think part of the reason that energy use per GDP has fallen is that we've offshored our CO2 emissions, basically, over time.
Right, which ties back to the Jeopardizes.
Just to push back on that, just when you talk about sustainability and economic viability, that seems to be a key consideration is how much energy we have to use to have whatever standard of living that people are aspiring to, and that's where that number seems to be germane.
On that note, let's thank all of our panelists. It's been a delight. So I gather from the schedule we have a break until 3:30, and then we reconvene for the fourth panel. Thank you very much. Thank you. It was great.